just wasn't appropriate for the audience. And the same token, depending on the emotional development, the development of the individuals that you're dealing with, that can have a bearing. There are situational crises. Um, you find yourself in a strange town. One of the worst, one of the worst nights I ever had was in Baltimore. Believe it or not, I was going from Mobile, Alabama. I got orders to go up to Williamsburg, Virginia, and so they took me off the ship and put me on a plane and flew up there and got into Baltimore. Well, there are no more flights that night, and this was back in the 70s, early 70s. And at that time, Baltimore airport was about as big as this room. I mean, it was tiny. There were no services. I found finally one vending machine, and I had about $1 in change, and that was about it. So I got in about 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and all I had all night was that candy bar. Oh, isn't that terrible? Oh, suffering, suffering. I didn't get fed till noon the next day. But you can be in situations which, by the very situation, because of where you are and what your thinking is, that can become a crisis. An existential crisis is, am I going to die? Going through wars, going through forest fires, going through getting lost in the woods. Yeah, you suddenly think, am I going to get killed? Am I going to get eaten by a bear? Am I going to fall down a ravine and nobody's ever going to find me again? There are a lot of situations, crises, where you think your very life is going to end. I'm sure that in Aurora, in that movie theater, a lot of people were going through existential crises when they were thinking, am I going to live through this? Am I going to survive? And that is certainly a crisis. There's interpersonal crises. Husbands and wives go through them all the time. Been married 47 years. It'll be 48 years this summer. We've had a lot of interpersonal crises, a lot of tough times, and it's been 47 years to the same woman. It's a struggle at times. Bless her heart, yeah. Somebody needs to. No. But there are interpersonal relations that can exacerbate or help a crisis. It's a terrible thing if somebody is faced with a crisis and has no one to depend on or no one to turn to. And there are a lot of people that feel like they're all alone in the world. There used to be a commercial, a billboard, and it says, all alone, pregnant, come and see. And unfortunately, it was for Planned Parenthood. And my problem with, well, never mind. There are spiritual crises. And I honestly and truly, if anybody says, well, I've never had a spiritual crisis, um, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, and that's one thing that I want to be in this class is honest. From time to time, we will always, all of us have had spiritual crises when we wonder about our faith and how strong it is and why did this happen to me. I said a little while ago about magical thinking. We do have that belief that if we're believers, if we're churchgoers, nothing bad is ever going to happen to us. And when it does, we get angry. And sometimes we get angry with God. People will say, that's sin. Well, don't you think God knows you're angry? Don't you think he knows you're angry with him? The creator of the universe knows us and is big enough to know and to recognize that we're angry. But we do go through spiritual crises. There are biblical crises, and if you read Scripture, you see over and over that there are many, many crises talked about in Scripture. Don't you think that when the Israelites saw the Assyrians coming again to take over their country, there were biblical crises? When they came in and took all the tradesmen, all the thinkers, all the successful people, all the healthy people, all the young, smart people, all the hard-working people, took them all away, and what was left in Israel? It says the poor. It says the poor were the only ones, but it's also the sickly, the useless people, the people that had no value. That's what was left in Israel. Do you think that was a crisis? Yeah, I think that was. What about the flood? Whoa, destroyed all of mankind except for Noah and his sons and his daughters and his wife. That was a crisis, I would say, of biblical proportions. And there were many of those kind of crises. David encountered all kinds of crises, being persecuted, chased through the woods, hiding in caves, fearing for his life every minute of the day. And there were many plagues of locusts. Yeah, you think about the Egyptians, and if being on this side as a believer, you think, well, those Egyptians got what they deserved. But if you're an Egyptian and you're thinking boils and flies and darkness and blood, and do you think that was a crisis? Let alone the death of the firstborn. That was a major, major crisis of biblical proportions. And we're going to have another one. We're going to have another one after the rapture. You think about how bad contemporary culture and life is. Think about what it's going to be when all of God's people are gone. We do have an influence on the way our culture operates. Maybe not as strong as it should be, but there is an influence. Believers are a restraint on the evil in this world. There's a lot of evil in this world, but think about what it's going to be like when all believers are gone. And I made a deal with God. I didn't want to go through the crisis or the tribulation, and so I made a deal with Him that He was going to. That's why I'm a pre-tribulation rapture theorist, because I don't want to go through this, and I believe God is going to take me out of it, and because why is He going to pour out His wrath on His people? I don't think that's possible anyway. And anyway, so He's going to take me out before all the trouble of the tribulation. But think about what it's going to be like for those people that are left. And let's face it, there are a lot of good people who are not believers. If you want to get your pitchforks, now is a good time to get it. But there are good, and we all know good people. People that do good, that help their neighbor, that are nice, that are pleasant. I was given a funeral once, and a guy came up to me and he said, I just want to share this with you, that I worked with a guy. This is my friend is telling me the story, Rimpy, and he said, I always thought he was a believer. He was nice, he was kind, he was always cheerful, pleasant, helpful. If you had trouble, he'd help you out. But he said, when I went to his funeral, I came to believe he wasn't a believer. And he said, it made me feel, and you know what I'm talking about. You go to a funeral of a believer, and it's not a bad thing. I mean, the people are friendly, the people are nice. It's I'm going to say, in some respects, it's a pleasant experience. You go to a funeral of an unbeliever, there are people that are crying and moaning and carrying on and on and on and on. I mean, it's really depressing to go to a funeral of a non-believer. It's just like they don't know what to do, and they do all sorts of just. I remember one, they were putting pictures in the coffin and teddy bears in the coffin and doing all this stuff so you won't forget us. And I'm thinking, ugh, talk about people who live without any hope. The lady, anyway. Job is a wonderful example of crisis intervention. And think about what happened to Job. In one day, he lost all his livestock, which is his wealth. In those days, that was their wealth. He lost all his land. He lost all of his children. And it was like no sooner had he recovered from one bit of bad news. Hey, Mr. Job, sorry to tell you this, but you lost all your cattle. Mr. Job, sorry to hear about this, but you lost everything. Oh, Mr. Job, sorry to say this, but you lost all your kids. I mean, it was just boom, 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 one after another. One terrible crisis after another. And then his friends. Oh, don't you love those friends? Well, you must have done something wrong. And all of us have come across those kind of people. Well, you did something wrong. I don't know what it was, but you did something wrong to deserve what happened to you. Now, maybe they don't say that just like that. But a lot of those things are things that you're thinking. Okay, now nobody's going to admit this, but the other night on The Walking Dead, and nobody watches The Walking Dead. I understand that, but if you talk to anybody and say, well, what do you think about what happened last Sunday night? Everybody's going to say, yeah, I was for it. No, I didn't. Oh, it's awful. Oh, yeah. But they didn't watch it. Okay. But in this, the bad guy, the good guy just lost his son. And the bad guy, who is truly a bad guy, is saying, it's your fault. Your son is dead. It's your fault. And that same kind of thinking, talking, sometimes is done by people. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, but it happens, and we need to avoid that kind of thing at all costs. Because the person already is thinking that. Oh, if I'd have done this, my family would have been safe. If I'd have done that. Remorse is something that happens as part of every crisis. Oh, if I'd have only turned on the burglar alarm. Now, I don't have to worry about it. I got a 4-legged burglar alarm, a 9-pound dog and a 6-pound dog, and they'll take on anything in the world. They'll tell me when the lady down the street is taking in her trash. I mean, they know everything that's going on and tell me all about it, so I don't have to worry about that. But people do have remorse and think, if I'd have done this, I'd have done that. And how many times has somebody said, when he left this morning, we were fighting, and I didn't say I loved him. And he was driving in his car and had a car wreck. And the last thing that person remembers is the fight we had. Never pass up an opportunity to tell your loved ones that you love them, because you never know. You never know. And it may sound corny, but we don't know what we have. Let's talk about the factors determining the impact of crisis. And for those of you that have your books, and I think everybody does have a book, this one, you got to give that back. Yeah. On page 33. On page 33, there's a chart there. And we're going to talk about that chart for the next 30 minutes or so. And on the left side of that chart, it says the crisis event. And it talks about rate of onset, severity, duration, and loss produced. In the middle, it said person. And it says coping skills, perception of events, support, and number of associated stressors. And then over on the right, it says plus or minus outcome. We're going to talk about that a lot. When you talk about the effects of trauma, all of these things interrelate to each other as to whether it is a positive or a negative experience, or the degree of positive or negative experience. And just like I say, there's no such thing as a perfect family or a perfectly imperfect family. Everything is on a continuum. That's true of crises events. First of all, let's look at the effects of trauma and how it impacts people. Well, first of all, there are cognitive symptoms, and this is in a lot of ways more familiar in the terms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There are problems with the way the individual perceives of the world or interacts with the world on a mental basis. That's called cognitive symptoms. There's a difficulty in concentration, and it follows extremes. A person may have the 1,000-yard stare where they walk around kind of numb. They're just looking around, and if you looked at some of the pictures, some of the videos after the Twin Towers collapsed, you see some people walking around in a daze. Yeah, they're covered in dust. Their clothes are torn. Maybe they're bleeding somewhere, and they're just kind of walking around. In the movie Independence Day, when the spaceship arrives, I watch a lot of movies, so get over it. The spaceship arrives, and there's people standing out there in the street, and then they get run over by a car because they're just lost. The 1,000-yard stare. They're unaware of what's going on. They're kind of numb to everything, and in the old movie, they slap them a couple of times, kind of like the movie Patton. Remember what Patton did? Get out of that bed, soldier! You're just a coward. Slap, slap, slap. For which he got in a whole lot of trouble, by the way, because the news reported all over the world. He hit a private because he conceived him or perceived him as being a coward. That is one cognitive reaction at one extreme. The other extreme of that particular cognitive problem, difficulty concentration, is the opposite of that. It's hyperactivity, where you see a person just going a mile a minute, doing 1,000 different things. A lady might, how can I say this without sounding awful? She might get real busy cleaning the house. Now, don't yell at me. It's just the first thing that came to my mind. But, you might see somebody getting real busy doing things, and they're hyper vigilant. They're hyper, and they're just going 90 to nothing. That's kind of the opposite of that cognitive numbing. They're totally wrapped up in doing a whole lot of things. And there are a lot of times, I'm sure you've done it. You just, hey, just sit down. Let's talk, because you see this person doing all this stuff, and they're not making any progress. It's kind of like biking on a stationary bike. They're pedaling like crazy, but they're not going anywhere. And that's kind of the extreme of the numbness that happens. There are flashbacks. Sometimes these occur at night, sometimes during the day. A person will relive the situation, and they'll go someplace and something will trigger, and they'll go through their traumatic event. They'll see it happen again and again. Maybe they'll dream it and it'll be at night and they'll suddenly wake up and they were reliving that experience. And some people will say that's an important coping mechanism because each time that you have that flashback, your reaction to it is a little bit less, and over time it becomes easier to cope with. And we say this to people. We say this to people so, in individual crises. You know, the husband walks out, the wife dies, the husband dies. Don't want to sound too chauvinistic and always talk about, you know, the wife dying, but and what do we say to them or allude to? In time you'll get over this. And that's part of the reason why some societies, like I say, have grieving procedures, grieving traditions. You wear black for 30 days, and then after that you put on your glad rags. In New Orleans for all you Northerners, Nolans, had the scare of my life in about 1974 or 1975 or something. I was going to report down to the unit down there, and driving down St. Claude or St. Bernard. It changes its name. The street goes like this, and it's called three different things, but it's the same street. We turned a corner, and there was wall-to-wall people coming towards us, and they were jumping around and hollering and hooping, and I turned to the guy with me and I said, "We're dead." It was a funeral. Going to the gravesite, they go in mourning, and the music is very subdued, and you know, it's a dirge going to the gravesite, but coming back they're celebrating life. And so they're celebrating living and the life and the memory of this person. Two distinct opposite situations. Coming over here, funny how things work out that way. I was listening to Will the Circle Be Unbroken? And in that, the singer sings, "Driver, please drive slow, 'cause that woman that you're hauling, oh, I hate to see her go." And he's talking about how much he cared for his mother and that he doesn't want to. Yeah, and the final phrase in that song is that he held together until they laid her in the ground, and then he just lost it. Well, yeah. There are flashbacks, and I'm sure that some of you know exactly what I'm talking to. People will react very differently to the same situations or to similar circumstances. And I've said this before, but I emphasize it again, that you see something, you know, the famous thing, the combat vet who's walking down the street, the car backfires, it's 4th of July, somebody sets off firecrackers, and what does he do? Oh, gee, are those firecrackers? No, he ducks and covers, hides behind a car. Colonel North, the disgraced guy from Watergate, said when he was on when he was a newsman embedded with some group in Iraq, that he was there talking to somebody, and some shells started landing around, and the first thing he did was, well, he didn't have his gun there because he was a newsman at that point. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but he still reached for it, and that happens. You this would mean nothing to you or I, but this person may have a skill set, something embedded in his mind. He automatically goes there. That can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. I was talking to a guy who had been a jump master in a helicopter, and they were doing an insertion of a SEAL team, and the helicopter came down. The jump master was watching the SEAL team get into the water, and something spooked the pilot, and the pilot nosed down to get speed because he panicked. Nose down, got some speed, and that threw the jump master off balance and kind of threw him off where he was standing because he didn't have his safety harness on, or it wasn't buckled or something. Anyway, that threw him down, and then he did a rotation, and the guys in the water said that about 500 feet they saw him falling out of the back of the helicopter, and they said that he flailed around for a while. 500 feet is a long way, but it's not too long a fall. But he flailed around for a little while, got his bearings, got his feet down, got his arms across his chest, grabbed his vest, got his head down, crossed his feet, and did a perfect water landing. Now, he didn't remember all this. The guys in the water saw him, got over to him, called in for a medevac, got him on there, and then they went on with the mission. But he woke up in the hospital, and apparently these guys came to visit to see how he was, and they told him what had happened. He relied on his training and equipment and experience, and just, it took over. Sometimes a reaction to a similar circumstance can be good because it can save your life, but sometimes it's inappropriate and maladaptive. Guilt. Yes, there's no doubt in my mind, that deputy sheriff that has been railed on, his name is mud. Yes, he stood outside while the shooting went on. Don't you know that that man is filled with guilt? Why didn't I go in? Why now? Apparently the sheriff said don't go in, wait, I don't know. It's protocol to wait for backup, but I'm certain that he feels guilt, because good or bad, resource officers start to know some of the kids. Brittany always talked about the resource officer they had at William Chrisman, and how he would go down to the biology department and find a mouse and feed it to the snake, and he knew some of it. He even had nicknames for some of them, and yes, Brittany was one of them. I think because she probably called him on it, because she's very shy, 5'3", and I'm sure she gave him a lot of grief for feeding mice to the snakes, and so you could watch him get eaten. But I'm sure this guy feels guilt over the fact, because he heard those gunshots, and he knew that some of the kids he knew were being killed, and I'm sure he knew what was going on, and he is branded a coward for the rest of his life. So not only does he feel guilt for what he didn't do, but then there's all these people that have railed on him. And I know we all saw the movie Patton, and remember Patton in that speech. And by the way, Patton never gave that speech. That's a compilation of many things that he said throughout his life. And just like our current president, he said a lot of stuff that was really inappropriate or ill-timed or whatever. And for Patton, they, just like with Donald Trump, they spread it all over the news wire. And so that speech at the opening of the movie Patton was a compilation of things he had said throughout his life. But you remember some of the things that he was saying about, well, don't worry, when the time comes, you'll know what to do. And I won't get into some of the stuff he said because it's not appropriate for Bible class and for videotape, because it'll be passed along forever on the internet. But yes, guilt is there's a book called Lone Survivor, and a lot of time, and that part of that has that concept In I think it was the 80s, an airliner crashed in Sioux City, Iowa, and there was a couple hundred people on there. It crashed in a cornfield. One girl survived the crash. Everybody else was killed. Her parents were killed. I mean, and one of the things she expressed was what is called survivor's guilt. Why did all those people die and I lived? Why was I the one that was spared? And they feel bad because they survived. But survivor's guilt is a very strong thing. In that book, Lone Survivor, that's one of the things that he deals with, is the fact that all of his buddies on the team were killed, and killed painfully. But he survived. And how can he justify that? How can he justify it? And what is the reason for that? And it's like a lot of things in life. There are no answers. There are no answers. But guilt is one of those things. Futurelessness. Futurelessness. The concept of, I can't go on from here. A lot of times this happens with individuals, particularly married couples, for example. And you'll hear this from the survivor. How can I go on without John? How can I live without Susie? My boyfriend is left-handed, you know. How am I gonna get by with moving on? But there really is that thought, and it's common. It's common when people have been married for ages and ages, 47 years. When one passes, soon thereafter, the other one will pass also. I have a friend who, talk about tough year, Joe. And that's his real name. Joe had a tough year. That's when we first really became friends, and this is years ago. But within one calendar year, his wife died of breast cancer. His father died from something. 2 or 3 months later after that, his mother died. And then 2 or 3 months after that, his only child, his daughter, got married. And when a daughter gets married, you know, she's gone. Well, some of them come back, but she's gone too. And you know, I did a lot of telephone counseling while I was supposed to be at work at Social Security, talking to Joe, talking about this, because you know, he'd lost his wife of, I think they had been married. He's a little younger than me, but they had been married almost, I'm going to say 25, 30 years when she died. And then, you know, his mother and father died within a few months of each other, and his daughter was gone out of the house. And here he was in this house that they had lived in for 20, 30 years, all by himself. All by himself. Now, Joe threw himself into work, and actually I got him transfer over to our department. And part of that was his a known evil versus an unknown evil, but also because I wanted him around too, because he had gone through a tough year. Fortunately, I guess I didn't say any stupid stuff. Sometimes one of the cognitive symptoms is an altered world view or belief system. And this can take many, many forms, but when a disaster strikes, when a terrible tragedy happens, and you know, all of us know what we were doing on September 11th, 2001. All of us watched on television as those planes flew into the Twin Towers. We all know what we were doing. And for many people had a change in their worldview. All of a sudden, things they'd never thought about became very important. All of a sudden, they did things that were completely surprising. I took my family on active duties to nice places. When I was going to go to Florida, they'd go with me. When I was going to go, someplace nice, they'd go. When I was going to Denton, Texas, no, I don't think I'm going to go with you. When I was going to St. Louis, I don't think I'm going to go. We've got other things to do, but to Florida, yeah, we'll go with you. That's great. My son never said a word about military. Got through college, and I stopped talking about military once he got into college. I just stopped talking about it. And I was still in reserves. Never said anything about it. Got his BA, started working at UMKC, and this is right around the time of that. He was working at UMKC, but he and his wife were in this school rental building, and 2 doors down was the Army ROTC office. One day he walked in there and says, I want to join up. Didn't say a thing to me. And how embarrassing. I had showed him how good the Coast Guard was, and he went and joined the Army, right? He said, I want to go through ROTC. I said, son, it's a 4-year program. He says, I'll do it. I'll do it in 2. And so they said, you can't do that. Well, could you check into it? So, they called up St. Joe, and okay, well, yeah, I guess he can. And sure enough, he actually went to advanced infantry before he went to basic. He did it. And finally, the last school he went to was officers basic, and he and 6 other people got their commission when they got out of Army basic, officer basic school. But he had all the rest done, and then he left and went to jump school. Just can't figure that out. But anyway, a crisis can change your worldview. A lot of times it's a loss of safety. We all remember what I said about survival instincts being important for survival. We all have this idea, well, I'm safe, nothing bad's going to happen to me, and then a car wreck comes along, a tornado comes by, a hurricane comes by, a windstorm, an ice storm, and all of a sudden we start to realize, oh, something bad can happen to me. Oh, I'm not immune to ice storms. I'm not immune to these problems. A worldview alteration where bad things can happen, and where you lose your I'm trying to think of the term escapes right now. I'll just talk until I remember what it is I'm trying to say. But we lose our naivety, and suddenly we realize, oh, we can be like that. And we even do that in day-to-day circumstances, and thank God. Sometimes we say, thank God, except for the grace of God, there goes I. And a lot of people in their testimonies at chapel have alluded to that fact, that had God not, there's even a song like that, had God not been on my side, tell me where would I be? Well, that's true, and people will sometimes lose that sense that there's something out there. I am vulnerable. When you're 18, you never think anything bad is going to happen to you. When you're 80, a lot of bad stuff has happened to you. It's a difference in perspective. So there is also a change in belief systems that you can go from don't worry, be happy to keeping your head on the swivel and expecting bad things to happen. I'm going to start in talking about emotional symptoms, but I can talk about emotional symptoms because we got 6 minutes before the first bell. Emotional symptoms, and I've talked a little bit about these in cognitive symptoms, but sometimes there's a numbness, and that's when I talk about the difficulty in concentration. Also, there's anger. I know it's a bad thing to talk about good believers and Christians, but people get angry with God. How could God do this to me? How could I've been good? How could He do this? And they get mad at others sometimes. The famous thing that the boss yells at you all day. The customers turn down your pitches. The traffic is bad, and so you come home and what do you do? Dinner's ready. Well, I was going to say you kick your wife, but yeah, you kick the dog. Yeah. Well. What was the country western song? I wish my wife loved me like my dog does. But sometimes we do get angry at something, and instead of taking it out on our boss, because we know if we show our anger towards our boss, he's going to fire us. So we take it out on some innocent person or some person who's not going to retaliate. That's wrong, because wives retaliate in some of the worst ways that they possibly can. We won't get into that, but we do show our anger at inappropriate places, inappropriate times, or against inappropriate objects. But there is that anger in there, and there was a back in, I don't know, 70s, 60s, 80s, somewhere in there. There was even a school of psychology that talked about, it was called primal scream. Remember that one? Oh, that was a wonderful thing. You're angry with the world, and so what you scream. And the theory is you get it out of you, you scream, and all of a sudden you feel so much better. It's like people that say, oh, fighting is good. Fighting is good in a marriage because it gets everything. I don't believe fighting in marriage is good. I'm just going to say that. You may not agree with me, but you have the right to be wrong. It's never a good thing to scream and holler and fight. Nobody wins a fight except the devil. Sadness. A lot of times the response to crisis is just sadness. And you will have some good Job friends come up to you and say, sadness, you're not supposed to be sad. If you were really saved, you wouldn't be sad. That's a kind of a thorn in my side, and I'll just tell the story and get it out. I was telling somebody that I was worried about a situation, and the situation worked out in the end all right, but I said, I'm worried about. And this is the face he is. It's called the evil eye. Don't you know that worry is a sin? Well, no, it is a natural emotion. And sadness is an emotion. You're not supposed to be sad. Says who? If characters in the Bible, if Jesus can grieve, don't you think we can? Don't you think we can be sad? And, I'm really going to get on somebody's nerves here. We were made in God's image. That's what my Bible says. We were made in God's image. If God made us in His image, and we have anger and sadness and worry, Does that say God does too? I think it does, but pitchforks and torches are available for a small fee at the gift shop as you end this ride. Sorry? I'm sure that accommodations can be made for tar and feather. Burn the witch. I already talked about another emotional symptom, which is hypervigilance, and that is kind of the opposite of numbness. And it's true that you can go either way, and sometimes that is a way for people to cope with loss, that you just get numb for a while. Now, with all these things, they're natural, but they can persist unnaturally long. And so it's important to give people a time to grieve, but then slowly you need to work them out of that and expect them to start getting over it. Things do get better in time. At a time of crisis, at the loss of somebody, you do think that you can never get past it and you'll never get over this situation. But for most people, that height of sadness or numbness or whatever it is will gradually diminish so that things get better. And you can tell them honestly, things will get better, because we're not to grieve like folks who have no hope, right? And notice that scripture doesn't say you're not supposed to grieve. It says we're not supposed to grieve like people that have no hope. And our hope is in Jesus. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, blessed are those that mourn. I believe what that means, and you can not believe me if you want, but like I said before, you have the right to be wrong. What that means to me is that when you grieve, God is going to comfort us because he sent us the comforter, and that we will see the face of God. We will be comforted by that being that is called the comforter, and he will come to us. And pity the person that has never undergone any disruptions in life, because most of them are not very interesting. You know, come right down to it, they're just not very interesting. It's like, who do you want in the foxhole? The old grizzly sergeant that's been through tough times and back? Or do you want somebody fresh out of boot camp that's never been anywhere or done anything? I want some old guy who's been there, done that. There was a writer, Elmer Keith, and he wrote a book. And the title of this book is Hell, I Was There. Now, that's the kind of guy I want with me when times get tough. I don't want somebody who's never had to face anything in their life. I want somebody who's been through it and gotten through it, because that's who I'm going to be. It's kind of like the demolition team members have a T-shirt that says on the back of it, if you can read this and I'm running, follow me. Okay, I think it's time to quit, and so I'm going to take a break. I don't know about y'all, if you just don't want to take a break. This is, by the way, this is going to be the last one for the night, because the next break, we're going to stop. And if you're